Here's how I 3D kitbashed a crusher from Darktide. After getting murked by crushers in game over and over, the least I could do is to make one. I like the pose of this crusher, so I'll try to emulate that. Being able to go in-game to get a good look at him really helped, and I kept referencing it as I kitbashed. First, I started with the mask. I couldn't find a model, so I decided to try to make one myself. Radium Minis recommended that I start from a plane and then use a solidify modifier, so I tried that. I made one half of the mask by selecting vertices and pressing E to extrude from those vertices. Once I got a shape I was decently happy with, I added the solidify modifier and increased the thickness. Then I refined the shape. I didn't execute this method as well as I would want because I ended up with a lot of flip to normals. You can turn on this blue and red view by turning on the face orientation box in the viewport overlays menu. I moved around the problem vertices until no red was showing. I made rivet holes with Boolean differences in spheres I imported, then placed smaller spheres in the new holes. I also added bigger rivets to the top of the helmet. I made the eyes by importing a sphere and scaling it. Then I imported a cylinder mesh, went into edit mode, and selected the front face. Then I created an inset with the Inset Faces tool and moved the new face inward. With one half of the mask made, I joined everything, applied a mirror modifier, then added a third eye. I made the horns by importing a cylinder, selecting vertices and pressing E to extrude from those vertices, and rotating parts of the cylinder to create a horn shape. I copied the horn to the other side of the mask by adding a mirror modifier and selecting the mask to mirror around. With the mask and horns done, I moved on to the body. I really like how the Maker's Cult Feudal Guard abhumans look, and I thought it would be a great base for the Kitbash. To match the reference image's pose, I selected the body, went into sculpt mode, masked off the torso, and then used the pose tool to make the standing pose into a hunched over one. I'm sure there's better ways to do this, and as always, I'd love to hear your tips in the comments below. I plan on using texture paste later to act as rust and to cover up some of the weird stretching that happened in the chainmail. Next, I made the cool concrete hammer by cutting off the end of this Station Forge hammer and turning on X-ray mode, and then selecting vertices with the selection tool. Then I selected everything, pressed P, and then separated by loose parts. Deleting vertices this way created an opening in the end of the hammer. I sealed it by holding Shift plus Alt, and then selecting one of the edge vertices. Then I pressed F to fill. I then moved the hammerhead into place. I selected both parts, right-clicked, and then selected Join to group them together. Next, I made lots of little spikes. I placed the little spikes around the arms and body wherever I saw them in-game. I made this easier on myself by turning on snapping, snap to face, snap by center, and then align rotation to object. It's actually kind of wild how adding spikes can instantly make something look chaosy. And like that, the digital part of the Kitbash was done. There was still a lot left to do post-printing. One of the identifying features of the crusher is the string of skulls around his torso and on his back. I took some floss and twisted it into a thin cord. Then I glued it into place. The skulls came from the Citadel Skulls box. To create more surface area to glue, and to have the skulls lie closer to the crusher, I trimmed the backs of the skulls. I took some jewelry chain and glued it onto his back, then added a few skulls. Plastic glue, ironically enough, melts plastic, so I melted away mold lines on the skulls using some ultra-thin plastic glue. This guy's looking pretty chaosy now. I glued on the arms and then moved on to the head. The crusher has this cool helmet that fits over cloth. To make the cloth, I put some green stuff into the neck hole and made a hidden head for everything to sit on top of. Then I took some blue shop towel, dipped it in watered down Mod Podge, then glued the head on over it. Once it all dried, it was rock solid and wasn't going to move anywhere. I made the cables coming out of his face with 2 different gauges of guitar string. I had to put a little ball of green stuff on the end and superglue them on that way, because superglue doesn't really work very well on metal. And that's the whole Kitbash done. Now on to painting. As always, I start with a zenithal highlight. This is so I can see everything and glazes will show through better. I also sprayed up from below with red to give the shadows a warmer tone. I was contemplating airbrushing the main color, but decided against it since the skulls and eyes were so nicely shaded by the zenithal highlight. I mixed metal color steel and black to get a dark steel armor color and picked out all the armor bits. This was pretty tedious. I left half of his chest plate unpainted so I could add hazard stripes later. I then glazed black onto all the chainmail. I painted the pouches and hammer handle with burnt umber, and his belt and skull string with skeleton horde contrast paint. The cloth under his helmet was a mix of flat red and burnt umber. I based his hands with flat flesh, and then highlighted with Rakarth flesh. God dang it. Next, I painted various metal bits with copper and steel. I can't recommend the metal color range enough. Then I painted the markings on his armor with a few coats of flat red. I didn't worry too much about having it look really clean because it's supposed to be worn. I also glazed a little red onto the concrete hammerhead to give it a little color variation. Next, I started on the hazard stripes on his chest plate. I painted the whole area with Averland Sunset. A while ago, I made a transfer sheet with some hazard stripes on it, so I decided to try to use that instead of painting on stripes. Normally, you'd want to apply a thin coat of gloss varnish below where you're applying a transfer to make a smooth, even surface. But I was too lazy to do that this time. I cut out a little section of stripes from the transfer sheet and placed it in some water for about a minute. I slid the transfer off the paper beneath, and then placed it on the model. I then painted on a little micro sole to soften the transfer and hide any edges. I cleaned up the edges a bit and painted missing portions of the hazard stripes, and that was that. Nice, crisp lines. The last step for base coating was applying an all-over oil wash. Then wiping away the excess with a dry brush. I let that dry overnight, and the base coating was done. Now time to highlight everything. You guys recommended me trying out some sort of flow aid, so I did, It made a huge difference. I had no problem getting paint off of my brush when I used it correctly. I highlighted the armor by moving up from the base coat color and adding French Mirage Blue. And then French Mirage Blue mixed with Model Color Buff. I tried making scratchy and blotchy highlights on the armor to make it look like chips and scratches. I find that making little light dots looks pretty cool. It makes the armor look chipped and adds a little interesting texture. I also highlighted the red lines on the armor with flat red mixed with white. The hands were highlighted with some Rakarth flesh and then washed with Reikland flesh shade to give a warmer feel. I also highlighted the pouches and the handle with burnt umber mixed with buff. I thought the chainmail was lacking, so I dry brushed on some steel. Then, I highlighted all the metal and made little chips in his armor with model color silver. Next, I applied Typhus Corrosion heavily to the chainmail and sparingly to some corners of the armor. Then I added Ryza Rust. I like how the bright orange looks against the dark armor. This was my first time using Nailac Oxide to weather copper. I think it turned out pretty well. There was only a few steps left to do. First, I glazed the eyes with red. Then, I painted on some symbols that I saw in the game. This is where the flow aid really helped the most. It's very difficult painting such small details while filming and trying to work with a big camera in the way. But using a dark color to clean up lines helps a ton and is worth the effort. The last step was panel washing with Nuln Oil. I also tried to strengthen the shadows here to increase contrast. Finally, I added him to his base, and he was done. I love how he turned out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, feel free to like and subscribe. Leave any feedback or suggestions in the comments below. Alright, bye-bye!